The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
This, for me, is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly into one. I mean, on a personal level, I've played the game hundreds of times now, and I still enter the caves and I look at Rob's work and I'm just absolutely overawed, just gobsmacked by its beauty. And I just think it's a really magical moment in gaming for me, actually. I know that probably sounds really dramatic, but I just think it absolutely hits something where everything just works together. And the music is so dreamlike. You know, Rob has talked about the journey through the body, and I think that's absolutely, for me, the music becomes so organic and fluid and actually very feminine and female at that point. You're hearing the voice of his love.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself, but I think it is, I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just, it's a real high watermark. I kind of, it's one of the areas in all of the games we've made that I'm most proud of.
I think as well, you think you know what you're getting with Dear Esther for the first 45 minutes of the game, wherever we are at this point, and then you step into something completely unexpected and completely new, and I think it just throws the player such a curveball in such a wonderful way.
I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things, that if a player does this, then this, and we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time, about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer, as a creative, is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over the last few years, and like Journey was a really, really good example of that game company really focusing on what's the emotional experience of playing this game. But I think, again, it's probably one of the reasons why Esther has lasted as long as it has done, because it's not a mechanical exercise, it's an exercise in trying to inspire you as a player to have the deepest experience and the deepest engagement, and to really run the game in your own head rather than being something that you're sitting 6 feet away from kind of interacting with. I hate interaction as a term for that. I think it becomes very cold and mechanical and systems driven, and really interaction is completely trivial and pointless if there isn't an emotional engagement with the player and you haven't moved it away from the screen and into the player's head. What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life 2 modders, and they made it what it is. And so if you've made something that the real kind of hardcore of the hardcore, in terms of these are first-person shooter modders, have gone, this is really good and really special and we're behind this, then you've already got the support of a really amazing gaming community, and the fact that they championed it, we owe them a huge amount in terms of where we are. And I'm really proud to come out of that scene. I'm really proud to be a company and to be sitting here talking about a game that started life as a mod.
Yeah, I think they're the ones that have really kind of like pushed us forward and given us the passion to be able to take it to a commercial level and give us the confidence to make us believe that there's an audience for this kind of thing.
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first journey into thinking about how you write music for games rather than films. So I had this song that was a certain length, and Dan said, well, we don't know how long the player is going to take to traverse through that space. And I thought, oh no, he's right, and slightly panicked. So this was a very simple solution where the song was split in half, and then I wrote some drone music that could just play for as long as was needed as the player walked through the space, and then the second half of the song would seamlessly play. And it's very, very simple, but it's quite emblematic for me in terms of my career, because it was the first time that I had to think about the player. Because with film music, it's so simple. You know exactly what's going to happen when. But this concept of interactivity was so new for me. So I kind of look back at it fondly, because it's quite a basic approach to, compared to something like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, where that was an open world adventure where I had to really think about the player and their movement through the space. So I kind of look on this very fondly, this moment in the game.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you at this point in the game, is kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island. And the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the coma, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like, this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution. And there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something, it's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, yeah, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games. In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant it really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then it was, you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really, really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely, and rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, it was able to, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge, because suddenly I was having to write like a poet, of going, every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound has to be absolutely perfect, or it'll just feel like the narrator's voice is intruding on the rest of the experience. So it was, yeah, I think definitely the most challenging area of the game as a writer.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult. And yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we have this long corridor that's full of these kind of it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it, of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. And it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like, you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of just, it's just total madness, you know. Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and confused, and, you know, I think it really helps to bring the tension up at this point at the level as well. So you're kind of coming out of this dreamlike state a little bit.
Yeah, you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of the serenity into something that's a bit more disturbed than that. this is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this, with the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound, and I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it that breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air. And I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realisation for me, but you're having to go back under again and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious and that struggle. Booyah!
There's actually a really interesting thing about that underwater section there, though, is that, I don't know if you remember, but you had a certain piece of music that plays when you're underwater, and to me, I really like that. It's kind of like, because at this point, it's kind of like a very calm, relaxed type of a journey, and you go on the water and it starts to break apart a little bit, and it's almost like, that kind of psychosis is still there. It's not complete bliss at this point, and and it helps to build the atmosphere up to this final jump.
So we're both saying that Dan's wrong?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good. That's the way it should be. The motorway scene. The biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing.
Yeah, it's I wasn't sure where the idea spawned from to have this scene, whether I just sort of went off or we discussed it, or I can't remember.
I can't remember. Can you remember? It just kind of appeared, didn't it? And then
it was just this kind of. I think for me, actually, I remember being some technical difficulty between the drop and then coming out at the end part, but it was the same thing that we dealt with in the past of like, how do we not kill the player? From a technical standpoint, I think it might have been something to do that, but it was also, I can't remember where the whole thing came from.
I think it's my favourite point in the whole game, actually. I think it's just it's quite shocking, and it's so surreal, and it's so beautiful. And from an audio point of view, you have that baby's heartbeat bringing us back to the idea of the ultrasound. Was Esther pregnant? And it's one of those moments that I think everything just kind of collates together, and it's so unexpected.
Yeah, for me, it's like a moment of realization.
Yes.
It's like, it's coming to terms with something almost,
Whether or not what actually is going on at the moment is real, this did happen. There's kind of an absolute. I remember playtesting it, and I didn't know that the car can get switched out with a hospital gurney, and I must have played it. I was like 3 or 4 times into playtesting it, and the first time it switched out and it was a gurney instead. I really remember kind of sitting there and going, "Oh God, that's just," and really being just stopped in my tracks by it. And it's one of those weird things you get when you're making a game that you'll never have those moments that a player does, where it all so well. It's really, really rare to be in a situation where you actually get a genuine, fresh player's eye view on what you're making.
Yeah, I was always a bit worried that it was maybe a bit too literal. Like we gone a bit too literal with that. But I think looking back at it now, there's still a lot of strangeness going on there. Obviously, the whole scene is unusual, but there's still these like very subtle details that are there that kind of still making you think, what does that mean? Like I think if you look closely, there's like coins scattered around and things like that. It's
and for me, it's, again, sorry to keep going on about it, but it's about layers of subconscious for me, that you start overground, you go into the caves, you go deeper, you're falling down, it's going down the rabbit hole effectively, and then you go to the deepest level, and that's actually the truth, that's the reality, that's what happened.
So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But
As
we
has
also
been
know,
pointed out
as
to
pointed
you.
players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love about, what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. Gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike. But actually, I'm talking about, a car accident just outside a little chef, and that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this. And the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah,
because she sings always, always throughout, we've got always, always, and then she sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and I
think it's rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like that kind of just totally made it